Mercantilism in the 17th century laid the foundation for England's commercial leadership in the 18th century. Mercantilism aimed at increasing the power of the state, specifically increasing the nation's stock of gold, because more gold equals more wealth equals more power. England's Navigation Acts are a prime example of mercantilist ideas. Established by Oliver Cromwell in 1651, the Acts required that goods imported from Europe into Scotland and England be carried on British ships. These laws gave British merchants and ship owners a monopoly on trade with British colonies. The Navigation Acts eliminated foreign competition, benefiting British merchants, workers, colonial plantation owners, and farmers. Not only did it do this, but the British hoped to develop experienced seamen who could serve in the Navy. So one, they controlled trade, and two, develop seamen for the Navy. Sounds like an amazing concept. The Navigation Acts were also used for economic warfare, their initial target being the Dutch, because they were ahead of the English in foreign trade. With the help of the three Anglo-Dutch wars, the Navigation Acts damaged Dutch commerce. In 1664, the British seized the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, and by the late 17th century, the Dutch were behind England in trade. England set its sights on France for the rival in overseas empire building. France was dangerous, 3 to 4 times the population of England and allied with Spain. They were the leading military power and close to monopolizing colonial trade. From 1701 to 1763, England and Spain fought a series of wars to decide who would become the maritime power. The War of Spanish Succession, beginning in 1701 and ending in 1713, resulted in the Peace of Utrecht, which made France cede Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay to England. The English also got control of the West African slave trade and were allowed to send one ship of merchandise into the Spanish colonies annually. Conflict continued among the European powers over both domestic and colonial affairs. The War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748 started when Frederick the Great of Prussia seized Sicilia from Austria's Maria Theresa. The war ended in an inconclusive standoff, leading to the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. Austria allied with France in hopes of recovering Sicilia from Prussia, which had formed an alliance with Britain. While France and Britain fought for dominance in the overseas colonies, Prussia struggled to defend its territory in Europe. The war ended in 1763, with Britain and Prussia emerging as the main victors. Britain's success established it as the world's leading naval and colonial power, while Prussia secured its position as a major European state by retaining Sicilia. As Atlantic trade expanded, the countries and territories that could tap into those trade routes became rich. Because of this, major European powers tried very hard to colonize territories on the trade routes. England colonized the eastern shore of North America and a few islands off of India. These colonies provided England with a ton of money, so much that London became Europe's largest and richest city. Not wanting to miss out, England's eternal rival France also established colonies, specifically in modern-day Haiti. By 1789, Haiti, or the colony of Saint Domingue, became the world's most profitable New World colony. Even Spain, having long been economically behind England and France, began to find revitalization through founding colonies. It bought Louisiana from France in 1763 and gained control of California through Spanish missionaries. The system of trade that sustained these colonies was described as triangle trade. European commodities like guns and textiles went to Africa, enslaved Africans were transported to the New World colonies, and goods produced by these colonies went back to Europe. At the core of this Atlantic trade was the brutality of the African slave trade. At its peak in the 1780s, the slave trade took about 80,000 people from their homes and forced them to work in plantations across the colonies. It is estimated that almost 2 million slaves died during the imprisonment process from 1701 to 1800. The rise of this brutal practice was directly a result of the establishment of plantation agriculture. Because so many natives had died of European diseases, the plantation owners were in need of free labor, and therefore resulted to slavery of Africans instead. In the late 1780s, Britain began to experience serious pushback for the slave trade, leading Parliament to abolish it in 1807. However, slavery continued in British colonies in the Americas for decades after. As the Atlantic world developed new communities, colonies were established and grew significantly. Some people named Creoles were people of Spanish ancestry that were born in the Americas. Some wealthy Creoles prided themselves on following European lifestyles. These lifestyles included owning lavish plantation estates. They maintained townhouses, also theaters, central squares, churches, and coffee houses. They also purchased luxury goods made in Europe. Often, the children of these people were sent to their home country to be educated. Creole traders and planters increasingly rejected taxes and regulations imposed by colonial bureaucrats. This led to a riot against colonial powers. Not all European colonies were wealthy. Some poor whites worked as clerks and shopkeepers. With the exception of British North America, white Europeans made up a minority of the population. Most European migrants were mostly male. Most of the population of the Atlantic world descended from unions forced or through choice of European explorers and African men or women. Due to this, new race laws prohibited people of color and whites from marrying. Also, some laws even had people of color wearing specific attire. British colonies followed close to these laws and rules. As European colonies expanded, the mixing of races and cultures created complex new identities in the Atlantic world. Colonial officials tried to organize people into racial categories, which reflected and influenced Enlightenment ideas about race. In many colonies, mixed-race populations, especially in the Portuguese, Spanish, and French colonies, sometimes rose to positions of wealth and influence. In contrast, the British colonies developed differently. Because entire families migrated, white populations grew faster. British laws also strictly forbade marriage between Europeans, Africans, or Native Americans. In the Caribbean and southern mainland colonies, mixed-race children were usually kept enslaved rather than freed, which created a much sharper divide between the different populations. Cultural blending also shaped colonial life. Creoles and colonial elites began to adopt elements of native culture, such as local foods like chocolates and potatoes, and even native remedies for tropical diseases. Some mixed-race people tried to pass as white to gain access to Creole privileges, while others built their own communities and social hierarchies based on wealth, family ties, and skin color. Religion played a major role in shaping identity across the Atlantic world. European powers, especially Catholic nations like Spain, Portugal, and France, focused heavily on converting indigenous peoples into Christianity. Missionaries, such as Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans, set up missions across Latin America, which helped establish strong Catholic traditions that still exist today. In North America, however, conversions were less common because native peoples were more spread out and independent. Protestant groups, including Quakers, Methodists, and Moravians, made some efforts to convert enslaved and indigenous people, but Protestant missionary work remained limited. Slavery created a major contradiction within this Christian mission. Many slave owners refused to baptize their slaves, fearing that Christianity might lead them to demand more rights. In many colonies, African spiritual traditions survived and blended with Christianity, forming new religious practices that combined both African and European elements. Jews also became active participants in the Atlantic economy. Though they faced discrimination and restrictions, such as limits on how many slaves they could own, they played an important role in trade networks across the Atlantic. Jews were legally considered white Europeans and could not be enslaved, but they still faced social and legal barriers because they were not Christian. During this time, Enlightenment ideas began to take hold in the colonies. In British North America, the Scottish Enlightenment had a strong influence encouraging practical thinking, self-improvement, and moral behavior. These ideas were spread mainly through colleges and universities, which were still connected to the church. American thinkers like Benjamin Franklin embodied this common sense Enlightenment, blending practical science and political thought with moderate religious views. Franklin and others, such as Thomas Jefferson, were deists, believers in God who rejected organized religion, but they continued to respect religious customs publicly. Meanwhile, Enlightenment thinkers in Northern Europe often criticized Spanish American colonies, portraying them as symbols of religious superstition and backwardness. This was partly because the Catholic Church was tightly controlled by Spain and its colonies, limiting the spread of new scientific and philosophical ideas. As the Atlantic economy started developing, Europeans competed for domination over Asian trade. The Portuguese were dominant in the Indian Ocean spice trade from 1500 to 1600. Overall, the Portuguese dominated, but had a flaw, as they did not fundamentally alter the age-old pattern of Indian Ocean trade. The situation of the Portuguese dramatically changed once the Dutch and English decided to intervene. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was formed. This company took control of the spice trade by taking the port of Batavia in Java. This was specifically as Batavia was the center of all operations in Portuguese's spice trade. The Dutch East India Company took over all the power of the Portuguese, taking over the trade and most East Indian islands. The shift of power from the Dutch to the Portuguese transformed the trading world. This was because the Dutch took total control of the East Indian states, unlike the Portuguese, as they let the East Indian states have total independence. Later in the 18th century, the Dutch couldn't meet the changing consumption patterns of customers, so the English East India Company started to undercut the Dutch. As the English East India Company couldn't establish a strong footing in Indian Ocean trade, they leaned towards India. As spices were the majority of Dutch shipping, English got a source of the lucrative trade as textiles, silks, and pepper. After the English established trade in India, they relied heavily on the Mughal Emperor, who controlled most of the subcontinent. Later in 1716, the Mughal Emperor accepted empire-wide trading privileges. This led to the English waging war on Indian princes, seeking more power involving themselves in local incidents. Now the English led the Dutch as the largest trading empire in the world. This was because the English had established diversity in the trade, as the Dutch relied heavily on spice only. Now the English largest competitor was the French. Then came the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, often called the world's first global war. It was fought in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. In North America, it became the French and Indian War. Britain and Prussia teamed up against France, Austria, and Spain, and by 1763, the Treaty of Paris confirmed Britain as the world's most dominant naval and colonial power. France lost Canada and most of its empire in India, and Britain walked away with the global trading network second to none. Now that the English had minimal competition, their trade took off. After the Mughal Empire granted the English East Company the right to civil administration and tax collecting, the English had economical and political dominance in the subcontinent. The English had disguised this commercial empire as a business, later leading to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Also during and before this time, the English established land on the continent of Australia. Captain James Cook for the English claimed land off the east coast of Australia in 1770. And through the 1790s, settlement spread to the western portion of Australia. Colonies were made by importing prisoners from England for hard labor. Cook was later killed in 1779 by islanders in Hawaii and is known for having the first maps of the Pacific Ocean. That was a lot of reading. But to summarize everything I just said, by the end of the 18th century, Europe had transformed the world. Mercantilism had turned into an empire, Britain's navy ruled the seas, its merchants ruled trade, and its colonies spanned the globe. But the price of its global dominance, slavery, exploitation, and cultural upheaval, left scars that are still visible today. The age of trade made Europe rich, but it also remade the world for both better and worse.